The city was falling asleep, dissolving into the silence of late afternoon. The yellow lights of street lamps cast jagged shadows on the cracked asphalt, and somewhere in the distance, in neighborhoods where the police appeared only when necessary, were the echoes of voices. Officer Randall Wilson drove his patrol car down the deserted road, clutching the steering wheel with a frown. The day had worn him out. The stupid calls, the bureaucracy, the superiors demanding reports, all of it irritated him to the core. He wasn't someone who wore a badge to protect and serve. To him, it was something else. Power, dominance, the right to bring people to their knees, especially those he didn't think deserved respect. Wilson ran his hand over his stiff chin grudgingly and hummed, glancing at the rare cars passing by. Most of them were immaculate, with proper drivers who knew how to behave. But he waited, seeking. And that's when he noticed her. The dark car was moving smoothly, unmolested, but something about it caught his eye. He couldn't tell whether it was habit or instinct, or more likely an instinct he'd nurtured over the years. The headlights illuminated the rear window, and he saw her, an elderly black woman behind the wheel. A chuckle touched the officer's lips. Well, what do we have here?" he muttered, reaching for the radio, but changed his mind. There was no point in calling someone. He can handle himself. The flashers flashed in the night, tearing the darkness with red and blue lights. The engine roared as he stepped on the gas, approaching the car. The woman didn't speed up, didn't try to get away, just calmly swerved to the curb and stopped. Too calm. This did not please Wilson. He was used to frightened faces, to nervous movements, to the fear that came from people he stopped. This woman didn't even twitch. His fingers tightened on the handle of the flashlight as he opened the door. "Let's see what kind of bird you are," he muttered, stepping out into the night where they were already waiting for him. The car stopped at the curb, its parking lights flickering in the darkness, casting a faint glare on the cracked asphalt. Inside the cabin, the woman calmly rested her hands on the steering wheel and stared into the rearview mirror. She knew what was about to happen. Officer Randall Wilson moved at a leisurely pace, but in every step he took, he had the confidence of a predator who had caught his prey. He didn't need to look for a real reason to stop. Her skin color was enough. Clutching the flashlight in his hand, he tapped on the glass, slowly, with pressure. The woman rolled down the window, and a soft stream of night air rushed into the cabin. "License and registration." His voice sounded harsh, almost rude. He didn't add "please" on purpose. She silently reached for the bag in the passenger seat, but his hand suddenly rested on the handle of his gun. "Slowly," he barked. The woman froze for a second, then continued on, purposely not changing her pace. He watched her carefully, but something inside began to irritate him. She didn't flinch, didn't stutter, didn't make excuses. No fear, just a silent calm. She handed him the papers, and he snatched them up, glancing at the driver's license. The name didn't tell him anything, but the age 63 made him even more annoyed. "It's a little late for traveling, isn't it?" he said with a wry grin. "I didn't break any rules," the woman replied in a steady voice. He didn't like that tone. He was accustomed to other things, to begging, to excuses, to blank stares. But here was an old black woman who somehow thought she could talk to him as an equal. "Really?" He leaned closer to the window. The flashlight in his hand pointed directly at her face, blinding her. "I think we were violating." "And what did I violate?" The question sounded unchallenged, but there was something incomprehensible about it, as if she already knew the answer. Randall grinned. Let's see. He deliberately started flipping through the documents slowly, even though he already knew they were in order. He paused, glancing around the car. Clean, neat, the smell of fresh leather interior and something expensive, hateful. He couldn't stand people like that. These people, the ones who thought they could afford more than they had to. Quite an expensive car. He ran his hand over the roof as if assessing it. Did you buy it on your pension? Or maybe the drug dealer's son gave it to you? He said it calmly, but he saw her jaw twitch for a second. That pleased him. I'm not going to comment on that, the woman replied just as evenly. His smirk disappeared. You're not? He stepped forward, his face now only a few inches from hers. You think you're smart, don't you? You think I'm just going to let you go? She didn't look away. I think if you want to charge me, you're going to have to come up with something convincing. He stared at her silently for a few seconds, then abruptly swung the door open. Get out of the car. On what grounds? I said, get out. He didn't wait, grabbed her forearm and yanked. Not hard, but enough to make it clear that he was in charge. She had gone out in silence and now stood under the light of the lantern, her face still as calm. But Randall was no longer satisfied with that. He wanted more. He wanted fear. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments what city you are from and whether you are listening to our stories for the first time. Has something similar happened in your life when power was used against you unfairly? We want to know what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. Officer Randall Wilson looked down at the woman, enjoying the way the streetlight emphasized her age. He liked seeing her in that position, forced to stand on the cold asphalt, arms crossed in front of her like a criminal. He walked around the car, running his hand over the shiny hood. The car annoyed him as much as its owner. Too clean, too expensive, too not who he thought it should belong to. Gee, what a swallow. He leaned over to the driver's seat and peered inside. You must be well connected, huh? Maybe a boyfriend with money? Or maybe someone else? He wanted to evoke emotion from her. He longed for a reaction, but the woman stood silent, steady, showing no sign of agitation. He turned slowly toward her. Unbutton your jacket. She didn't even blink. Why? He took a step closer, overwhelming her with his presence. Because I said so. Or do I have to do it for you? The cool night air enveloped the street, but the tension between them heated up the atmosphere. The woman, slowly, keeping her gaze on him, unzipped her jacket. That's it, he said with a satisfied hum. Look how well we do when you listen. He grabbed her bag and opened it without permission, flipping its contents right onto the hood of the car. Keys, wallet, cell phone, all fell out with a thud. He went through the things methodically, deliberately careless, swiping them like trash. I see you've got a nice place here. There's no way there's anything unclean in here, is there? His voice dripped with contempt. He felt he was approaching the point where even the most resilient would break. The woman remained motionless. Are you done? He slapped the roof of the car with the palm of his hand, and the sound echoed down the empty street. Who are you talking to like that? He stepped forward, looming over her. You think I'm just standing here for no reason? You think I stopped you for no reason? That's your problem. You always think the laws protect you. He grabbed her shoulder sharply and spun her toward the car, piling his weight on top of her. Hands on the hood. The woman sighed, but obeyed. The cold metal touched her palms. Now we'll see what you have in your car. You don't have a warrant, she said calmly without turning her head. He grinned, pulled out a flashlight, and pointed it straight into the cabin. Warrant? Oh, do we have a lawyer here? He deliberately spoke louder, almost mocking. I'll tell you what, I don't need a warrant if I suspect you're a threat. You know what I suspect? He moved closer to her ear, his voice becoming almost a whisper. I think you're just a regular old lady who has decided she's allowed more than the rest of us. He pulled sharply on the door handle and swung the back door open. Let's see what you've got here. He slowly examined every pocket, looked under the seats, moved the mats, and every second he felt her watching him. He hated that look. There was no fear in him, no pleading, not even anger. There was something else, something that suddenly made his heart clench. So, did you find anything? Her voice sounded sudden, like a stab in the back. He turned around sharply. She stood, still calmly resting her hands on the hood. And in that moment, it seemed to him that it was he who stood before the judge, not she before him. The cold light of a lone lantern flooded the street, turning the night darkness into a scene. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no people to stop what was happening. There was only Officer Randall Wilson and an elderly black woman standing by her car. The woman did not resist. She didn't even try to say anything or justify herself, and that pissed him off. She wasn't afraid. She should have. Randall slammed the back door of the car so sharply that the sound rolled down the deserted street. Nothing? He threw Riley, approaching her again. What a bloody miracle. Usually there's always something interesting in these cars. The woman continued to remain silent. He grabbed her wrist sharply, squeezing it so that his fingers dug into her dry skin. I asked you a question, old woman. She shook her head slightly, looking directly at him. You're too aggressive. Wilson's lips curled in a grin. You're too cocky. Maybe I should check you for weapons. You could be a threat. I am 63 years old, the woman replied calmly. I don't care if it's 103. He turned her around and pressed her chest against the hood of the car. The cold of the metal pierced her thin coat fabric, but she didn't even flinch. Feet wide, hands behind your head, he hissed. She obeyed, slowly and with dignity. But that didn't suit him. He wanted to see fear. He wanted her to feel she belonged. His hand slid down her back, then lower, deliberately roughly checking her pockets. Well, ma'am, not used to it, huh? His voice was soaked with venomous pleasure. Used to white boys bowing to you? Well, I ain't one of them. He pushed harder. The woman didn't flinch. Aren't you afraid of the consequences? She asked quietly. He laughed. Consequences? He jerked her away, causing her to stagger. Do you even know where you are? This is my town. This is where I decide what is a consequence and what isn't. He took a step back, scrutinizing her like the dirt beneath his feet. And you know what the funny thing is? Nobody gives a shit about you. No lawyers, no reporters, no man with a camera to record me putting you down. He leaned closer. You're just a black woman in an expensive car. Who cares about you? She turned her head slowly toward him, and a strange gleam flashed in her eyes. Randall suddenly felt uncomfortable. What? He threw, trying to grab her arm again, but before he could do so, she uttered a single word. Remember this moment, officer. He froze. Something in her voice, something about her confidence. Randall felt an invisible chill slide down his spine for a second. But he quickly pushed the feeling away. I don't care what you memorize, you old monkey, he snapped, but there was something tense in his voice. The woman turned her head forward again and looked calmly at the road in front of her, and he suddenly realized that she already knew how it was going to end. The city was asleep. A deserted street, a street lamp, an ugly light spreading across the asphalt. No one around. No witnesses, no cameras, no cars to slow down and see what was going on here. That's how he liked to work. Officer Randall Wilson ran his palm over his belt, feeling the weight of the gun, the handcuffs, the baton, symbols of authority, symbols of his integrity. He didn't need to be afraid of anyone. He could have done anything, and she was still standing, hands pressed against the cold metal of the car, with her back straightened and her chin raised. It's too calm, too confident, and it pissed him off. He waited for the moment when her voice would quiver, for her to make excuses, for him to see the fear, but the fear didn't show up. Do you even realize who you're talking to? He grabbed her arm again, squeezing the thin bone with his fingers harder than before. She turned her head and looked straight into his eyes. That look. Randall froze. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't the victim's gaze, not the look of an elderly woman facing an armed police officer on an empty street. It was the look of a man in control. "Are you sure you want to continue?" she asked calmly. That voice, it cut right through him. Like he wasn't an officer, but someone who was about to be tried. Like she knew something, as if she knew more than he did. He yanked her sharply toward him, forcing her to take a step back, but her feet remained firmly on the ground. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed. The woman did not avert her gaze. "This is a question you should have asked before." Randall felt something strangely prickling inside. Something's not right here. Her confidence, her voice, her calmness. "No one can save you." His voice was muffled, but it was no longer mirthful. He said it deliberately to assert his power. No one's stopping. No one's gonna help. This is his territory, his town, and yet, why did he have the feeling that invisible eyes were watching him? Why did it seem to him that he was not the hunter, but the prey? He shook his head, trying to shake off that strange feeling, and grinned again. "So, you want to play, ma'am? That's fine. I love it when they fight back." But in that moment, he realized one thing. She didn't resist. She was just waiting. Randall Wilson felt the cold air of the night envelope his skin, but inside he was torn by a burning irritation. The woman was still standing in front of him, her back to the car, but now she was no longer touching the hood. She was staring at him, and that look was turning him inside out. He had to savor this moment. Just another disenfranchised old woman for him to break, humiliate, trample on. But somehow things weren't happening the way he was used to. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she suddenly asked. Her voice was quiet. No threat, no fear, just a question. Randall hummed. "Are you serious?" He smirked, but for some reason something inside twitched unpleasantly. "You think you can scare me?" The woman did not answer. She just stared, and he didn't like it. He was used to the different expressions on the faces of the people he was breaking. Tears, panic, pleading, but not this. I said, "Kneel." He took a step forward, leaning over her. She didn't move. "This is your last chance, ma'am," he hissed, his fingers tightening on her wrist. The woman bowed her head slightly as if studying him. "Do you realize you're ruining your life right now?" He yanked her sharply toward him. "You're going to ruin yours, Grandma," he almost shouted, but her gaze remained the same. "Are you sure you want to do this?" There's that question again, like she knew. It was as if she had already seen the future. Something icy slid down Randall's spine. Only now did he realize he was not in control of the situation. Only now did he feel doubt. He felt he wasn't playing by his own rules, but it was too late. He crossed the line. And she knew it. Let's pause for a little more. Write in the comments what city you are from and whether you are listening to our stories for the first time. Have you or your loved ones ever been in a situation where power was used against you unfairly? It's important for us to hear your point of view. Also subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And now we continue. Officer Randall Wilson clenched his jaw, his fingers white with tension. He could feel the irritation growing inside him, turning into something boiling. That old witch is too calm, too confident. He was used to seeing fear in people's eyes when he loomed over them in the dark. But now, he looked into her eyes and found nothing there. On your knees, he repeated, this time slowly, angrily, almost hissing. The woman bowed her head slightly, her gaze sliding over his face as if she was assessing something for herself. And then she said it. Officer Randall Wilson, badge number 4728. He froze. Something clenched coldly in his chest, but he didn't even flinch on the outside. What? He breathed out the word with a short laugh, as if he'd heard something ridiculous. But her voice was steady, cold, as if it wasn't her standing in front of him now, but him in front of her. Born in Richmond, Virginia, entered the service in 2005. 5 reprimands for excessive force, 2 incidents hushed up by internal investigations, 1 closed shooting incident. Her words were a blade, and each word sliced him wide open. Randall frowned. What the hell are you talking about? But there wasn't an ounce of doubt in the woman's eyes. That's funny. She shook her head slightly. A man with a history like that really thinks he's going to get away with it. He swallowed, but immediately clenched his fists, hiding the incomprehensible feeling in his chest. How do you even know? I know more than you think, she interrupted calmly. Her voice was no longer just a voice. He was the verdict. Wilson could feel the anger boiling up inside him, but for the first time in a long time he felt something else, something he hadn't felt before. Anxiety. That old bitch. Who is she anyway? Randall Wilson felt his insides tighten. Something in this woman's voice, in her tone, made him feel an icy prick of alarm. This has never happened to him before. Her face was calm, but not in the sense of a driven person who has resigned herself to fate. It was the calm of someone who had already won. Who the hell are you anyway? His voice was harsh, but there was a cracked note inside. The woman shook her head slightly, as if he had one last step left to take toward the abyss, and he didn't even realize it. And then she uttered, slowly, with pleasure, Dr. Evelyn Carter, head of Homeland Security. Silence exploded in his head. The world has stopped. He looked at her and couldn't breathe. Lips opened, but no words came out. Number. There's no such thing. His throat constricted. His fingers, which he had so recently used to squeeze her hand, became emotionless. It's a joke. It's a prank. It's impossible. But the look on her face was too real. Randall felt something in his chest fall into an endless pit. He just crushed his career. With my own hands, by his own power, which he used to abuse. And now he was looking at the woman before whom he was a nobody. He could beat, humiliate, intimidate, but not hers, never her. And now he was realizing it. It's too late. Randall Wilson stood petrified, his gaze blank and an inferno brewing in his chest. The woman in front of him was not just a victim, not just someone he could break and humiliate. She was a sentence. His sentence. You can't. He tried to say something, but the words turned into an incoherent babble. She stood just as she had before. Calm, confident. Her eyes looked at him as if she had already decided how this evening was going to unfold, as if she no longer cared about what would happen to him. He felt a mixture of panic and acute realization tearing from within. It's over. This whole horrible obscurantist evening, this whole humiliation, it didn't matter. He knew her words weren't just a threat, they were a judgment. He swallowed quickly, trying to regain some confidence, but his throat felt as dry as sand. Look, I can explain everything, he said, trying to regain control. I didn't know who you were. You realize I'm just doing my job. But his voice sounded weak, quiet. She didn't even move. Her silence was stronger than any words. It pressed on his chest like 1,000 tons of stone. I didn't mean to. He stopped talking, but continued. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just didn't expect you to be so important. You weren't supposed to be in this place. He frantically tried to gather his thoughts. He didn't realize what he was saying anymore. All he knew was that he was wrong, and that was a disaster. The woman didn't answer. She looked at him as if she had already decided his fate. Panic began to fill him. He was willing to do anything to avoid the consequences. Look, I'm sorry. I apologize for everything I said, everything I did. His voice sounded like a plea. He leaned forward, trying to take the stance of a pathetic lie. I didn't know who you were. I just did my job. But she didn't move. Her silence left him no room for excuses. He didn't feel her angry or hurt. She was indifferent. That was worse than any aggression, any violence. Her calmness was a verdict. He went on, but the words came out of him mechanically, haphazardly. You can't just go and ruin everything. Everything I've done it's just a job. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her eyes left him no choice. They were unwavering, and he realized he could no longer stop what he'd done. This moment didn't just change his fate, it consumed it. With every word he uttered, her silence poisoned his soul more and more. A single word flashed through his mind that made everything inside him clench. The end. Randall Wilson sat in the dark room, his hands heavy on the table, his thoughts jumbled in his head. His mind could not escape the scene, the eyes that stood before him, and the words that echoed in his ears. The woman didn't say a word to him when he tried to justify himself. She just stood there, looking at him calmly as if she had already decided his fate. And he knew. He knew he no longer existed. His name, his career, his life, all of it was now under a shameful stain. Now there was nothing left for him to do but watch it roll downhill. He expected to be called into the office, to be discussed. But what happened that day was not just an investigation. It was a public humiliation. A few days later, the moment he was finally at the police station, the order came. Strip him of his badge. He sat in the shadows of the office, knowing that his actions, his racist antics, his self-righteousness had left him no turning back. Seized badge. ID taken. Left without a job, he realized that he had become a shameful example to everyone. He could have justified himself. He could have claimed he was under stress. He could have said he didn't know who she was. But it would have been too late. His name soon became embedded in the consciousness of all who served on the police force. Wilson. His career, his reputation, was destroyed in an instant. He became a living reminder that abuse of power will not go without consequences. His own public humiliation was the one lesson he would never forget. The woman he humiliated, the one he tried to scare, turned out to be the one who judged him. She is part of the system, and now he had to reap the rewards of his actions. Every day he met the gaze of every policeman who now turned away from him. He heard the whispers that swept through the corridors and realized that his name had become synonymous with shame. He was walking out of the building when he was fired, and the door slammed shut behind him with a thud. It was his last step, and there were no thoughts in his head about how he could make things right. It was irreparable. Now his name was forever inscribed in history as one who used his power to destroy his own destiny. His life has become a lesson that is taught every day. What do you think about this story? Have you had an experience with racism or unfair treatment in your life? We really appreciate your opinions. They are really important to us. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll be sure to read everything. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for listening to the end. Write the phrase, "I'm listening to the end," in the comments so we know you're with us until the end. We wish you a good day.